Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We are continuing reading of Iqbal's Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. And we had looked at this paragraph starting from "It is the inadequacy of the logical understanding," but we'll just go through it again to see if there is anything which was left or which is anything we can add to it. So it is the inadequacy of the logical understanding which finds a multiplicity of mutually repellent individualities with no prospect for their ultimate reduction to a unity that makes us skeptical about the conclusiveness of thought. So there are a few things here. So as we saw, by logical understanding, he means understanding as such, understanding in the Kantian sense, I guess. And when we talk about ultimate reduction to a unity, we can look at this reduction to unity in two ways. Reduction to unity in two ways. So we have multiplicity. We have multiplicity and seeking unity within this multiplicity, because without that we can't understand the whole. And the problem with logical understanding, according to Iqbal and I guess Hegel as well, is that it understands or it can only understand the relationship between things externally. And it cannot understand the relationship between things internally. And why we need to understand the relationship between things internally, and we can't be content with understanding the relationship between things externally, is mainly to do with Hegel's objections and his distinction between bad and genuine infinity. And I think, or I guess, the same reasons can be given for the inadequacy of the merely external understanding. So external understanding is needed. External understanding between things is needed. And that's why we need a logical or analytic understanding as well. But this understanding can't be it's necessary part of our understanding the world, but it can't be sufficient for understanding the world, because this sort of understanding is mainly dictated by pragmatic needs, the needs to deal with things, the needs to use things, the needs to dominate things, but it's not sufficient for understanding things as they are or in their very being, or something like that. So that's why I think, where were we? So it is the inadequacy of the logical understanding which finds a multiplicity of mutually repellent individualities with no prospects for their ultimate reduction to a unity. So in order to understand things from within, we need to reduce them to a unity that makes and a logical understanding cannot do that because it is trying to understand things from outside. Makes us skeptical about the conclusiveness of thought, that is, self-sufficiency of thought. Now, ultimate reduction can mean two things as well. So reduction to unity can be understood in two ways as well. So reduction to unity in one way to understand it is to say that multiplicity is reduced to unity, or traced back to unity in the sense that it has a single source. And that single source can be source of its being, or that single source can be a principle of its organization. So that will provide it with the unity which is sought for. Another related way to understand this reduction is to see multiplicity as ultimately to a singularity, in the sense that this multiplicity is basically manifestation of this singularity in various ways. and then we will end up with some sort of monism. And would have to explain the multiplicity internally from the very nature or essence of this singularity. And in a sense, there won't be anything else, because if there is anything else, then we would have another multiplicity. So these are two ways we can understand in this talk of reduction to unity. In any case, logical understanding cannot do that, because logical understanding or analytic understanding, or understanding in the Kantian sense, is incapable of doing that, because it understands things externally. And as I said, and I'll come back to that, this argument ultimately goes back to Hegel's distinction between, which we looked at a few sessions ago, bad and genuine infinity. And why genuine infinity can only be understood internally. Okay, so let's move on. So, in fact, the logical understanding is incapable of seeing this multiplicity as a coherent universe. Coherent universe, it's only because its only method is generalization. Its only method is generalization based on resemblances, but its generalizations are only fictitious unities. Fictitious unities. Its only method is generalization based on resemblances and differences, I guess. Resemblances and differences, but its generalizations are only fictitious unities. Fictitious unities. Why they are fictitious unities? Fictitious unities do not affect the reality of they are fictitious unities because they do not affect the reality of concrete things. So, in other words, they are external unities. They are trying to understand things from outside. They don't penetrate into the essence of the thing itself. And to penetrate to the essence of the thing, so to understand the essence of the thing, you need to understand it from within. Okay, and generalization is obviously from outside, looking from things outside. And it seems like he's saying that if you look from things from outside, you can only end up with generalization. The only method would be generalization, even if you think that your method is, your method is more than generalization. Because Kant, for example, his method is different from Hegel, but it's not, his categories are not generalizations, they are pure concepts or pure categories. But Iqbal would say that this amounts to the same, because even if the claim is that they are pure categories, that's just a claim, because if you are trying to understand things from outside, then you will end up with generalizations of one sort or another. That's what seems to be his intention here. Let's read it again. So, in fact, the logical understanding is incapable of seeing this multiplicity as a coherent universe. Its only method is generalization based on resemblances and differences, I guess, but its generalizations are only fictitious unities which do not affect the reality of concrete things. Now what comes after this shows the cogency of the interpretation I have been trying to make in this paragraph. In its deeper movement, however, thought is capable of reaching an imminent infinite in whose self-unfolding movement the very finite concepts are merely moments. So this is understanding from within, and it's closely related to Hegel's concept of infinity and Hegel's critique of what he calls bad infinity, and Hegel's positive concept of genuine or true infinity, with which we dealt in the previous session. But now we need to understand this connection between internal understanding or understanding from within and Hegel's concept of infinity, because what Iqbal seems to be saying here is, unless we accept Hegel's concept of infinity and his critique of bad infinity, we can't understand the universe from within, the reality from within. We will end up with logical understanding only, and so we won't be able to understand things as they are. Okay, so let's see how this is related to Hegel's concepts. So let's recall Hegel's critique of what he calls bad infinity. Bad infinity is an infinity which opposes infinite to finite. Which opposes infinite to finite. And why it is a bad conception? It's a bad conception because by placing finite outside infinite, outside infinite, you are actually limiting the infinite. Because if infinite is outside finite, or finite is outside infinite, then infinite is not where finite is, and in that sense infinite is limited. In fact, it is not infinite. And from this Hegel drew a radical conclusion, and that radical conclusion was, and the radical conclusion Hegel drew from this was that the infinite only genuine infinite can be an infinite basically an infinite which incorporate or absorbs finite within it. Because if there is anything outside infinite, then infinite is not an infinite. The only viable, only logical conclusion to be drawn is that if there is infinity, then there can't be anything else. Everything must be contained in that infinity. And the way Hegel, I called it radical conclusion in the context of his argument, but the conclusion and the basic structure of argument is not that radical. It has been the contention of pantheists all along. They say if God is infinite, there can't be anything other than God. So Hegel's conclusion is that there's only infinity, and that Hegel, basically follows Spinoza, who was he was hugely influenced by Spinoza, and this is the argument of Spinoza as well. Obviously, not in the same way, but the basic structure of the argument is the same. That if there is infinite, genuine infinite, there can't be any finite. So what we see as finite is basically part of moment of infinite. The only difference between Hegel and Spinoza here is that Hegel, infinite is dynamic, like it is self-developing. It's not complete. So in that sense, it might be limited, but limited by itself, for its own future possibilities, not anything else. So that's just internal limitations. Now, how is this argument related to the obligation of or the necessity of understanding things from within? Because and that's the next thing which we need to focus on. That's the next thing which we need to focus on. But probably we should go back to the text and finish it for today, and we'll continue with this in the next session. So it is the inadequacy of the logical understanding which finds a multiplicity of mutually repellent individualities with no prospect for their ultimate reduction to a unity that makes us skeptical about the conclusiveness of thought. In fact, the logical understanding is incapable of seeing this multiplicity as a coherent universe. Its only method is generalization based on resemblances, but its generalizations are only fictitious unities which do not affect the reality of concrete things. In its deeper moments, that is from internally, however, thought is capable of reaching an immanent infinite, in whose self-understanding or self-unfolding movement, the various finite concepts are only merely moments. So we'll continue this in the next section, in the next session, inshallah.